start the day with Todd Norton from Manta network. So you will be talking about launching the trust setup on Substrate. So very interesting. All yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Todd. I work at Manta Network as a cryptographer. I should move a bit. For those who don't know Manta Network, we are a Polkadot parachain. We use zero-knowledge proofs to enable private transactions in multiple currencies in the Polkadot Kusama ecosystem. And the past 24 hours have been very exciting for Manta because we just launched our own trusted setup. So the last time I checked, we had over 300 contributions to the trusted setup. We had a queue of about 1,000 people waiting to contribute to the trusted setup, and many, many more registered. So we're looking to break records for having maybe the most contributions and the most diverse group of participants for a trusted setup. And to mark the occasion, I thought it would be appropriate to talk about what is a trusted setup, right? So the trusted setup ceremony is this kind of cryptographic mystery. You may have heard of it before because there have been a few of these in Web3, starting with the famous Zcash Powers of Tau ceremony, which became sort of legendary among cryptographic circles. But despite that, I think that there is kind of a lack of accessible explanations on what a trusted setup is for people who don't have a strong cryptography background. So I wanted to maybe start to bridge that gap a bit by giving an explanation of trusted setups using an analogy that I think everybody will understand regardless of whether you're a cryptographer or not. Okay? The topics, oh, that was supposed to be my title slide. The topics I'm going to be covering, we'll start with zero-knowledge proofs because you can't talk about a trusted setup without talking about zero-knowledge proofs. We'll talk about prover and verifier keys because these are really the central objects of interest in a trusted setup. Now, because those are a little bit technical and difficult to explain without a cryptographic background, I'm going to be using analogies. And the analogy that I'll be using is about mixing paint. Okay, I think everybody has mixed paint before, even if they've never touched an elliptic curve. And mixing paint is going to be an analogy for multi-party computation. So this analogy should give everybody an understanding of the idea and the goal of a trusted setup. And then once we've got that done, I want to start connecting it to some real cryptography. So I'll talk about things like discrete logarithms. And then we can just maybe touch on 2 security properties that you need when you design a trusted setup to make sure that the outcome really is as secure as you wanted it to be. Okay? So, ZKPs. Sadly, I do not have time to give an explanation of zero-knowledge proofs to someone who has never looked at them before. So, if you've looked at them before, then you know what they are, and if you haven't looked at them before, then here's maybe how you ought to think of them. Every zero-knowledge proof relates to some statement, and I think an easy sample statement is, I have a wallet with at least 10 dot. This is the kind of statement that sometimes you may wish to demonstrate to me. You may wish, for whatever reason, to convince me that you have a crypto wallet that has at least 10 dot. And the naive way of doing that would be to simply share with me the address of that wallet. This would really compromise your privacy, though, because once I look inside that crypto wallet, I see not only that you have at least 10 dot, but in fact that you have 1,000,000 dot, or that you have a certain NFT that you may not wish to tell me about, right? So we need ways of communicating while respecting privacy, and that's what a zero-knowledge proof is all about. The idea is that in order for you to convince me that you have a wallet with at least 10 dot, you can send me some kind of cryptographic proof. And this is where I don't really have the time to get into technical details of what a cryptographic proof is. So we're going to introduce analogies to replace the real technical definition. But the idea is that you would be the prover, you would send me this proof, and then I'm some verifier, and I look at your proof and I do some kind of check. It's analogous to like a signature check, and it tells me whether your proof is valid or not, whether I should be convinced or not that you really do have a wallet with at least 10 dot. So, that's all I have to say on zero-knowledge proofs. The key that the sort of essential thing we need to talk about today is that many of the zero-knowledge proof systems that we use on chain use these proving and verifying keys. And those are a certain kind of public infrastructure. So by that, I mean that before you start using the system and sending zero-knowledge proofs, everybody needs to know what prover and verifier keys the system is going to use. So this is like public infrastructure, has to be pre-computed before the system is launched. What they are technically is pre-computed commitments to polynomials. But if I were to go down that road, I would break my promise to explain this to non-cryptographers, right? So we won't be talking about it in those terms. We'll use an analogy where we think of proofs as paintings. So I said that you are a prover. Bob Ross always makes people smile.
Yeah.
So I said that you're a prover and you want to convince me that you have at least 10 dot, right? Now in the analogy, I want you to replace prover with painter. Okay, so instead it's Bob who wants to convince me that he has at least 10 dot in a crypto wallet somewhere. And I said that the way you're going to do this, the way that you're going to convince me is you're going to hand me some kind of cryptographic proof. And in our analogy, the cryptographic proof is a painting, okay? And instead of verifying your proof, I'm just going to view your painting. And somehow I'm going to determine, based on looking at your painting, whether or not I think that it is a convincing proof, okay? So this is the analogy that we're going to be using because it's just a little bit friendlier, and I think we've all painted or at least seen paintings before. And the reason that this analogy works nicely is because these keys that I wanted to talk about, prover and verifier keys, they correspond to the palette. And palette, I know we're at a Substrate conference, so the word palette is very loaded. Okay, today palette is not palette. Palette is, of course, this board that Bob is holding in his hands, right? The one that has all the paints that he's going to use to make his paintings. Paintings that we're thinking of as proofs, right? And if you ever watched Bob Ross, then you know that he starts the show by telling you what paints he's going to put on his palette, right? He tells you need a little bit of forest green and a little bit of lavender, right? And he fills up a palette. And everybody needs to use the same palette as Bob if they want to follow along and make a painting like Bob's. Because if you use different colors, then you wouldn't get a painting that looks quite like Bob's. So this palette is really what we're concerned with today. Every painter needs a palette, and that's why Bob starts his show off by defining what his palette will be. In the analogy that we're using for zero-knowledge proofs, I said everybody, the whole public, the whole ecosystem of users has to agree on what palette we will use. And the reason is that if you were to paint your proofs using a different palette, the proofs would just automatically be invalid, okay? Just kind of go with me here, that's part of the analogy, all right? We just all have to use the same palette to paint these proofs. Otherwise, they won't work. Okay, so the thing that we're going to do before we launch our network is we're going to agree on a palette. We're going to form the palette from the three primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. We're going to mix these to make all the colors that we need for our painting. And I just want to emphasize, keep it in your head, that this palette is really an analogy for prover and verifier keys. Okay? The actual object of interest in a trusted setup is these keys, but we're going to pretend that it's a palette of paints. The palette has a very strange property, and it leads us to this concept of toxic waste, which you may have heard of if you've ever read about trusted setup ceremonies. They always talk about discarding the toxic waste. Okay, in our analogy, the way that it works is this. I said that everybody has to agree on the palette. So the most obvious way that you could get everyone to agree on a palette would be to just publish the recipes that you're going to use to make each color. By recipe, I mean how much red, yellow, and blue you'll mix to form your burgundy or lavender or whatever it is. But in this weird cryptographic analogy, the recipe must not be known. So we're in a situation where we need everyone to agree on the colors that we'll use, and yet it is essential that no one knows the exact recipe that made those colors. Why? Well, if you know the recipe, then you are able to paint fake proofs, fraudulent proofs. You can convince me that you have 10 dot in the wallet when in fact you don't. And on a network like Manta, fake proofs equate to free money, which is a very obvious problem, right? So for the security of the network, we need to prepare this palette in such a way that everybody agrees on the colors, and yet no one knows the precise recipe that creates those colors. Is the analogy reasonably clear so far? We're all on the same page? That's excellent. Okay, so great. So now we have to decide who can mix these paints, right? We can't do like Bob Ross. We can't just have Bob Ross mix the paints at the beginning of the program, because then Bob knows the recipe, right? And even Bob Ross is corruptible, right? He, with the power to create fake proofs and therefore free money, he would eventually be corrupted by that power. And so we just cannot trust any central party to mix the paints for us. And you may have guessed what we do instead. We need to resort to multi-party computation. So, multi-party computation is something you may or may not be familiar with. If you're not familiar, then we're going to present a very fun multi-party computation for mixing paint in such a way that nobody knows the exact recipe that led to that color. And it's a really simple idea. It goes like this. You need at least 2 people to do this. So we'll say that Alice is the first person to start off, and she has an empty bucket, and she has red, yellow, and blue paint. And she mixes some amount of red, yellow, and blue into this bucket, stirs it around, and she has some color that we might use as part of our palette. Now we should not use this color because Alice knows the recipe. She's the one who mixed it. So what we should do is have Alice pass the bucket to Bob. Bob takes the bucket, and Alice does not tell Bob how much red, yellow, and blue she put into that bucket. Bob will take red, yellow, and blue paint and add some of his own to the bucket and mix it up, right? And what we now have is paint of a new color where Alice and Bob can both use the same bucket of paint, so they agree on what color they're using, and yet neither one actually knows the recipe that led to that color, as long as Alice keeps her secret and Bob keeps his secret, right? Because Bob doesn't know how much Alice put in, nor does she know how much Bob put in. So we've got ostensibly a bucket of paint that works because nobody knows the recipe that made it, but is it really safe? Well, we ask Candace, we say, Candace, would you like to paint proofs using this bucket of paint? And she says, no, I don't think it's very safe at all. Because what if Alice and Bob were to collude with each other, right? Alice could tell Bob her recipe, and Bob could tell Alice his recipe. And now Alice and Bob both know the recipe, so both can make fake proofs, and so both can make free money. And therefore, the multi-party computation is really only as good as the degree to which Alice and Bob are honest participants, right? So the reason that that bucket of paint is not safe is because Alice and Bob could just too easily collude with each other to compromise the security of that paint. But there's a good solution to that. Candace can just take the bucket and herself add some red, yellow, and blue paint to the bucket. And she knows that as long as she doesn't tell Alice and Bob how much paint she added, that Alice and Bob, they can collude with each other, but they still don't know the recipe. Yeah? Okay, if you get that, then you get what is going on in a trusted setup. And I see nods of heads, and yes, so, and you also get more generally the kind of core idea that underlies a lot of multi-party computation. It's this idea that if we arrange our protocol properly, then we can achieve an outcome that is secure as long as at least one person is honest, right? In order to discover, after Candace contributes, in order to discover the actual recipe in the bucket, we need all 3 to collude with each other, right? So, is the bucket of paint safe yet? I would say no. I would still not use that bucket of paint because 3 people can collude way too easily, right? And so what we can do is maybe just continue. And Candace can pass the bucket to Dave, and Dave to, and so on and so forth. Maybe we need to pass the bucket 100 times, or even 1,000 times. I mentioned at the beginning that so far in Manta's ceremony, we've passed the bucket 300 sometimes, right? And so what that means is, to compromise the bucket of paint in our ceremony, we need all 300 people to collude with each other. Now, that is still possible, but it gets less and less likely, right? The conspiracy gets more and more difficult to organize as we add more participants to the MPC, a multi-party computation. And if we choose a diverse group of participants, right, then it becomes even harder to organize this kind of conspiracy. And so the idea is just that each time we accept a contribution, we improve the safety of the ceremony, because it gets harder for people to all come together and collude and compromise in this case, the recipe of the paint. Yeah? Great, great. Okay, then what I want to do is I want to connect to actual cryptography. This talk runs a bit short. If you want to interrupt with questions, that's okay. Okay. So yeah, what does this have to do with actual cryptography? The reason that analogy works well is because mixing paints is a lot like something called the discrete logarithm problem. You may have come across this before. Even if you haven't, you're familiar with the fact that paint is really easy to mix, but really hard to match, right? If I tell you that this is a recipe that will result in a lavender colored paint, it's very easy for you to follow that recipe and mix the right amounts of paint to get the color that you wanted. However, if I just show you a sample of that color, it's actually very hard for you to match the color to a high degree of precision, just starting from red, yellow, and blue paint. So it's this easy to mix, hard to match property that makes paint a good analogy for elliptic curve points. Okay, here's where we do start doing a little bit of cryptography. If you've never thought of elliptic curves before, then just keep thinking about paint, that's fine. But if you have, then this is the discrete logarithm problem. It works like this. Alice chooses a point from an elliptic curve, call it P, and she sends it to Bob. Bob chooses a scalar n, and he multiplies n by p. Sorry, p by n. And what Bob did in multiplying p by n, it's a lot like mixing paint, in the sense that it's actually really easy to do. It's an easy computation to do. You can do it fast. Now, what Bob has is n times p, and he sends that back to Alice. But he does not send the number n to Alice. So that number n is a little bit like the recipe for the paints, you know, when people were mixing it. N is like that secret recipe. Because now when Alice knows p and n times p, it remains really, really difficult for her to figure out what n is. That's the discrete logarithm problem. If you know p and you know n times p, you still will have a very, very hard time determining n. And it's not impossible, just as it's not impossible to match paint colors, it's just that it takes a long time, right? You achieve cryptographic security in the sense that it's computationally infeasible to compute what n was if you know p and n times p. So then to keep kind of walking back the analogy into the real world of cryptography, I said that paints were an analogy for curve points, and the prover key, that's like the bucket of paint they were passing around to make the palette, that's the prover key. Okay, the prover key is not paint, it's a collection of elliptic curve points. And the proof, the cryptographic zero-knowledge proof, is not a painting, it's a carefully computed combination of elliptic curve points. So what we're doing in a trusted setup ceremony is not actually passing around buckets of paint. Instead, what we're doing is passing around buckets of elliptic curve points, right? And when it's your turn to contribute, you receive these elliptic curve points, and you multiply them by a number, like the n on the previous slide, And that's easy for you to do. That's a lot like mixing paint. And then you pass the result along to the next person, right? So there's this line. It moves, in sequence. And that's how you contribute. You don't mix in paint, you multiply curve points by a scalar, right? But you don't have to know actually really any of the details of what those computations are, how they're done, to understand what's going on in the trusted set. So I hope that was clear, and that we can move on to some of the security properties that you need, because just because this protocol is a really effective way of making a bucket of paint that no one knows the recipe to, it's only effective if people follow the protocol, right? So how do we enforce the protocol, right? For example, Alice started the bucket of paint, and then Bob poured some paint in the bucket and passed it to Candace. Well, the protocol says that Candace should pour paint into that bucket that she received from Bob. But what if she dumped the bucket out, right? And just filled it up with paint all by herself? Well, then Candace would know the recipe in that bucket of paint. And like we said, the recipe, that's the dangerous, toxic waste. If Candace knows the recipe, then she knows how to make fake proofs. Okay, so it's very important that Candace not do that. It's very important that she follow the protocol and she build her contribution on top of Bob's contribution. And it's important that when Candace passes the bucket to Dave, that he build on top of Candace's contribution. And so what we demand is not only that you contribute, but that you give us some kind of proof. Now I'm using proof in a second sense. It's actually still a zero-knowledge proof. But we demand that you give some kind of proof that you followed the protocol. There's a nice way to explain what that proof is in terms of paints. I omitted it. It kind of takes too long. I would be happy to talk about it later. But the thing that you can just kind of keep in mind is that in addition to adding paint into the bucket, it's possible for you to produce some kind of certificate, some kind of proof that will convince somebody that you really did build your contribution on top of the prior contribution, which means that you really did follow the protocol of this multi-party computation. So then what happens over the course of the ceremony is that we get this chain of contributions and also this chain of proofs that each contribution followed protocol. And so then when you observe the ceremony later and you want to know, was this an honest multi-party computation, you have this chain of proofs that you can verify. And if you check every link in the chain, then you have checked that the entire ceremony followed the multi-party computation protocol. And so you can be certain that at no point did anybody dump out the bucket and fill it up with their own paint, right? You know that everyone's contributions are still there in that final bucket of paint because there's a chain of proofs. I admit, I didn't really explain how the proofs work, but I'm happy to talk about them later if you want. But this is enough to enforce that the protocol is followed, but it's still not enough to guarantee that the outcome is safe. And the reason for that is that somebody could actually just simulate a trusted setup ceremony. One person, let's say Dave, could pretend to be Alice and pour paint into a bucket and create this proof of honest contribution, and then the same person could pretend to be Bob and pour paint in a bucket and produce a proof of honest contribution. And he can do this as long as he wants and create this authentic looking trusted setup ceremony that in fact is not a multi-party computation at all, because Dave was every single participant in this ceremony. So it was, I suppose it was a uni-party computation that is just made to look like a multi-party computation. And so that's obviously not okay, because Dave knows the recipe, and we said the recipe is the toxic waste, and the toxic waste means fake proofs and free money. And so the danger of Dave doing this is that he may manage to convince people that the prover keys that he created himself are secure, and he may manage to get somebody to launch some kind of blockchain that needs prover keys on top of his fraudulent trusted setup. And if he does this, then he knows the toxic waste, and so the whole thing is compromised. So what can you do to prevent that kind of attack? There's a simple social solution that you can use. It's simply that when you contribute, you should make a public record of that. You should go and announce that in some public form. So in the paint analogy, what you should do after you mix your paint is take a picture of the color and tweet that picture and say, I participated, this was the color when I was done, right? Or in the real thing, maybe you hash the keys and you tweet the hash of the keys when you're done with your contribution. And by doing that, you leave these kinds of like traces, these footprints, right, behind of the fact that you contributed. And now, anytime somebody goes to verify our ceremony, they should not just check the proofs, but they should also collect as many of these public records as possible, and they should verify that each of those paint colors really did appear at some point during the chain of contributions, right? Because if Dave tries to simulate this ceremony, like I said, it's hard to match paint colors, and so Dave can't simulate a ceremony where Alice's paint color appeared and Bob's paint color appeared and Candace's appeared. Rather, he can, but it's just computationally infeasible for him to do so, right? Because of discrete log hardness or paint mixing hardness, if you will, right? So it's a simple solution, and it's the sort of the best one that we have to prevent this kind of attack, is to make announcements. So when you contribute to a trusted setup, it's a really important second step after you're done making your contribution, that you go onto Twitter or wherever it may be, and that you post the hash of your contribution, because that makes it impossible for people to later deny that you were part of that ceremony. All right, I will wrap it up. I'll summarize what the key points are. The key points are that most of the zero-knowledge proof systems that we use in blockchains require these prover and verifier keys. And these keys are not easy to make. You have to have everybody agree on them, and yet you have to hide this toxic waste that we talked about. So one person cannot generate the keys. Instead, you should use a multi-party computation to generate the keys. And that multi-party computation, that's what we call a trusted setup ceremony. It was designed in such a way that as long as one person keeps their contribution a secret, then the whole outcome of the ceremony can be considered secure, because you need the collusion of all participants in order to compromise the security of the ceremony. I mentioned that we enforce the ceremony's protocol by these sort of contribution proofs, and it creates a chain of proofs that can later be verified. And when you verify that chain, you also need to check the public records in order to know that people who participated at the time really are to be found in this chain of contributions. Now, once the ceremony is over, a user of the network who wants to have some assurance that they're using a secure network with secure proving and verifying keys can verify the transcript, the chain of contributions and proofs, and that would be a very convincing argument that the ceremony is safe. But of course, the most convincing argument would be if you yourself are one of the contributors, would it not? Because if you contribute and know that you keep your amounts of paint secret, then, well, it doesn't matter if literally every other participant in the ceremony was dishonest and colluded with each other, right? It's actually fantastic that you yourself can guarantee that, that the ceremony is secure just by contributing honestly. Now, it may sound difficult to contribute, right, because of all this stuff I said about elliptic curve points and multiplication, right? But it's not, because we have spent a long time creating a command line tool. It's a client that you can download that will connect you to our ceremony, that will receive the bucket of paint for you and do the computations that you need to do and pass it along to the next person. Now, this tool was written entirely out in the open. The code is on our GitHub repo at Manta RS. You can install from source code, you can inspect the source code yourself. You can see that we have no tricks up our sleeves. If you're really ambitious, it would be really cool if you wrote your own client, right? Studied the protocol and wrote your own client. But of course, we don't expect a great number of people to do that. So we have this tool, we've made it as convenient as possible. Nonetheless, if you run into issues, we're here to help. We have a demo table out there.